Hello and welcome. Electing a Muslim mayor in North America sounds like a contradiction in an era of Islamophobia. So what are the qualities Canadians see in Calgary's new boss? 38-year-old Naheed Nenshi won in a largely conservative city, beating two other highly rated opponents. Many credit Nenshi's success to Canada's multicultural model that encourages immigrants to preserve their ethnic roots as well as embrace their Canadian identity. But others say that Nenshi's victory happened not because of multiculturalism, but in spite of it. They claim the system actually creates ethnic ghettos, making it harder for new Canadians to integrate into the mainstream. Well, joining us now from Calgary is Naheed Nenshi, who, as I mentioned, has become the first ever Muslim mayor of a major North American city. And in Toronto, we have writer and activist Tarek Fatah, who believes integration rather than multiculturalism is the way forward for Canada. Mayor, starting with you, sir, you were trailing in the polls, running as a visible minority against two established candidates. And I wonder, how did you pull it off and win the election?
There were really three things going on. We had a community here in Calgary that was ready to have a thoughtful conversation about its future, that was rejecting caricature and left-wing and right-wing labeling that had already happened, a very powerful civil society in the community. Number two is we had a candidate and a campaign that was really speaking to the things that the community really wanted to talk about its own future. And number three, and much has been made of this, but we used every tool possible in order to make this campaign work by going to voters where they lived, both in traditional ways, in their homes, parks and festivals and churches and synagogues and temples and community centers, but also using a variety of online tools and social media to keep the conversation going. So those three things together, and you'll notice I didn't say any of those had to do with multiculturalism.
Well, interesting, and we'll get onto that in just a moment. Let me bring in Tarek Fatah here and ask, isn't that election of Mr. Nenshi a good thing? I mean, isn't it a good indication of success of Canada's multiculturalism?
No, it's an indication of a very good candidate winning an election. In fact, I've never met His Worship at any time, but I was in Calgary during the time he was trailing at third position. But he was the only candidate who didn't talk about tax cuts. You know, I remember listening to one debate where he said, we haven't seen the books yet. How can we talk about what's the limit to tax increases? That is a sort of honest discussion about management, about solving people's problems that came up. And what it did indicate is that much as many of North America's Islamist organizations talk about there being widespread Islamophobia, his election proved that the most capable person is very likely to win in one of the most conservative areas of this country. And this addiction of victimhood simply didn't matter. So I think the best candidate won. I mean, he's a young man, Harvard educated, management background, and I saw the people supporting him, and they came from all sections of society.
I wonder, Mr. Mayor, considering the rise of Islamophobia we've seen, especially in parts of the US, for example, and in Europe, how much did you feel your religion perhaps was working against you when you were having to campaign for the position?
Well, it really played no part at all. It really did not come out in the campaign at all. It's certainly come out since the election. But what I think is very interesting, I'm an Ismaili Muslim, so even within the Muslim world, a minority. But we had two incidents over the course of the entire campaign. One was we had some vandalism, and it happened to happen on September 11th. And as one commentator put it on that day, I hope that this was just the work of jerks and not racist jerks. And we had, very interestingly, the major newspaper here in Calgary wrote a feature interview with me. We had an hour-and-a-half interview touching on many topics across budgets and transit and so on. And they chose to write their future interview about my faith. And they wrote it in a way that, isn't this a good thing about Calgary, that faith hasn't been an issue? But of course, in so doing, they made it an issue for a brief period of time. What was very interesting there is their newsroom was inundated with phone calls. Probably 95% of people were saying, why are you making this an issue? It isn't. And then the other 5% were, well, straight up racists. But you get those in any community. I think overall, the fact that issues of race and of faith never playing a part in the campaign actually do speak to how well multiculturalism is working in this country.
Although, Mr. Mayor, there's one thing that in Europe the issue of immigration has become a source of friction. And just let's look at the growth of migrants from non-European countries to Canada. So let's show our viewers this. In 1981, when data on visible minorities was first collected, they represented just under 5% of the population. In the latest census of 2006, around 16% of all the Canadians were non-European migrants. And if the trend continues, they'll rise to a fifth of Canada's population by 2020. Now, I'm wondering what sort of problems could that create in the long run if friction does develop with the immigrant community because of what we've seen in places like Europe, for example?
Well, you know, this is a really good question, and the Canadian model is quite distinct from the European model. One might call it an Anglo-American Canadian model of integration of communities. So I myself was born in Canada. My parents and my sister immigrated to this country from Tanzania when my mother was pregnant with me. And I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood with many different ethnic backgrounds in it. And in our big cities, the numbers that you quote are across the whole country. The numbers in our big cities are much larger than that. So Calgary itself is about between 1/4 and 1/5 non-white, as distinct from immigrant, because we've had many non-white communities here for many generations. And this is just a fact of how we live and work together. I've often heard it said, the Aga Khan, if I may paraphrase him, calls Canada the most successful experiment in pluralism in all of human history. And I think this Anglo-American Canadian model of multiculturalism is very distinct from the European one. You know, you said off the top, Riz, that some critics call it ghettoization. I don't think that's true at all. I think that the Canadian model is very much one of be who you are, be proud of who you are, but work within the mainstream community. And in a city like Calgary in Western Canada, which is a new city where we don't have a lot of history, I think this model is working exceptionally well.